War Between Worlds, Chapter 6, Incarceration. With the proto-truck trashed, Rook and Jen were stuck at the local plumber base for a while. But that turned out not to be such a bad thing. The base wasn't too well equipped to hold a high-profile prisoner, not to mention the last time Vilgax had been captured, he'd escaped as soon as he was off of Earth. It seemed to make the other plumbers more relaxed that Jen and Rook were staying to help see off the prisoner transfer. So much so that Jen ended up taking it over in its entirety. They had 2 other plumbers with them, and an escort of 4 more ships that took them into the sector that was their destination, though they broke off to another plumber base as soon as the transport ship made it into the sector. Jen frowned, flicking a few switches on the controls, again checking that they weren't being followed. That was the 6th time she had done that in the last 15 minutes.
I do not believe that we have become targeted in the last few minutes,
Rook said quietly, his hands still on the controls and eyes still fixed on the space in front of them. Jen sighed, shaking her head. Yeah, I know. That's what's weird. Rook frowned, glancing at his partner. He had heard several of the plumbers she worked with regularly call her severely paranoid, but aside from their encounters with malware, he hadn't seen it to this level before.
What do you mean?
He asked, glancing back to ensure that the other plumbers weren't listening in. They weren't. Morty, the large pink ape-like being, was talking to Hobble, a smaller insectoid being who looked quite nervous to be there at all. Say what you will about Vilgax himself, and trust me, I've said it all, but his people care about him. The Chimera sui generis love their leader, as misguided as that might be. Most of the time, he escapes because they come looking for him. But once we're in range of Incarcicon, there's no way to get to him without plumber clearance. So, where are they? Rook frowned.
I do not know.
Jen shook her head again, unclipping her seatbelt and standing, stretching. It hadn't exactly been a short flight, and most of it had been too tense to grant any real rest. She patted Rook on the shoulder. Go ahead and signal Warden Kadak. Let him know we're almost there. Rook nodded as Jen stepped past his chair and towards the back of the ship. This transport had been retrofitted to carry their very specific prisoner. Several mounted guns pointed straight at the table he was bound to. It sat upright, facing the front of the ship. Jen tilted her head at him. He looked different without the front 2 tentacles that normally hung from his face. Smaller somehow, less invulnerable. Comfortable? She asked with a small smile. He glared.
I will escape, child. You and I both know this. We've danced this dance before.
And yet I keep coming out on top. Go figure. Silence reigned for a moment as the 2 mortal enemies stared each other down. Jen grinned a little wider. Well, you'll be happy to know that we're almost to your new home. Not exactly as comfy as the tank the Esoterica kept you in, but Incarcicon should suit you nicely. His eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. That told Jen all she needed to know. She turned away from him and quick-stepped back to her seat. Rook was currently talking to Max on the comms, the older plumber, warning all present to be wary. He expected a breakout by now. Jen stated it plainly, resting her chin in her hands, a look of deep concentration on her face.
Why has there been no attempt then?
Rook wondered aloud. Jen pulled up a readout on her console and shook her head. We don't have any plumbers in that system. The whole place is a no-fly zone for plumbers and anyone in the Galvin's Alliance. There's no way to check. Max nodded. Speaking of, once you go into that blackout zone around Incarcicon, there'll be no way to check on you either, so be careful. Jen nodded to her grandfather as the last of the evacuation skiffs flew past them. Incarcicon had changed quite a bit since the last time Jen had been there. Firstly, because this was not the Incarcicon she had visited in the Null Void with Gwen in search of a mutated and raging Kevin. In all technicality, this was Incarcicon Beta, the one in the Null Void being Incarcicon Alpha. This prison had, up until recently, been used for smaller offenders. ones who would likely not survive in the null void. This was something of a gambit on the part of the plumbers. As with most large organizations, there were bound to be leaks here and there, and to prevent the immediate escape of one of the universe's most dangerous tyrants, they had not specified which Incarsicon he was being transported to anyone other than Jen and Rook, who were leading the mission. The hope was that any trying to free Vilgax would attempt a breakout at the Incarsicon located in the Null Void and find themselves trapped there. But as they passed into the blackout field, those hopes were dashed by laser fire into the side of the ship. The whole thing rocked, nearly sending Jen toppling out of her seat. But despite that, she leapt up and swore as the ship shook again, sending her flat on her ass this time. "Charging the deflectors. Unfortunately, it will take a moment," Rook said, flipping switches as he did. But again, the ship shook as Jen grabbed hold of Rook's chair so she wouldn't go flying through the cabin of the ship. "His little rescue squad is getting a bit violent," she commented through a grunt. Rook nodded, frowning as the auxiliary controls kicked in. They landed, but it wasn't a pretty one, requiring them to make a quick space jump into the prison itself. Vilgax, now in a pair of shock cuffs, managed to kick off the plumbers holding him. Jen, currently a new transformation, a large humanoid hawk-like being, kicked him away from the others as the artificial atmosphere set in. Her momentum sent them both crashing into an adjacent hallway. Rook rushed in and had to physically pull Jen, now back to human, off of Vilgax. She glared at the tyrant from her spot in his arms. "Your little rescue squadron know you can breathe in space, or were you just not clear when you told them to break you out?" she snarled. It would have been quite intimidating, too, if her feet weren't almost 5 inches off the ground. But before Vilgax could answer, another of the ports to the outside of the station opened, and in stepped a figure familiar to only one of them. Jen's eyebrows climbed in surprise. "Atea?" The Incursion Princess pulled her blaster as several more figures stepped into the hallway. "I'm here for the head of Vilgax the Conqueror. You plumbers can keep the rest of him." Chapter 7, A Question of Morals. Jen was in a bit of a fix. She had been fighting Vilgax for years, literally since the first week she put the Omnitrix on. Sure, most of the time she won, though sometimes she needed help from people like Grandpa Max or Rook. But now, a sort of opportunity presented itself. Atea was hunting for Vilgax. If she and her assassins got their hands on him, they would be chopping off his head and leaving the plumbers with one hell of a cleanup job. But she wouldn't have to worry about facing him again. Worry about him getting his hands on her friends or family.
Tempting, isn't it? Knowing you have someone's life in your hands. But you know temptation. We held the same power for a moment. The power of gods, and you gave it up.
Vilgax sounded at equal parts confused and disgusted. "And I'm gonna tell you exactly what Kevin told you that day. Shut the fuck up." Of course, neither of them were aware of Rook watching the video surveillance. He frowned down at the screen in front of him. What had Vilgax meant? The power of gods. Rook shook his head, refocusing. He had to get to the communications room and shut off the blackout field. Switching the video feed, he nodded to the other plumbers. Their way appeared to be clear. He disconnected his scanner from the wall and nodded to the others. Jen really didn't appreciate being used as a cannonball while she wasn't transformed or ready for it. So maybe shocking Vilgax when she reactivated his cuffs was a bit petty, but no one else was around to see it. He glared at her.
"So, what will you do? Hand me over to the arrogant Incursion?"
Silence fell between them, and she knew that he could tell that she had considered that as a viable option. But she shook her head after a moment. "Like you said, tempting, but no. I'm gonna get you off this rat trap, alive, and make sure you wind up behind bars somewhere else." That seemed to surprise him a bit, but it didn't take them much time to reach the ship bay they were looking for. Unfortunately, Atea and her assassins had beaten them there and laid an ambush. Rook pulled through, though, with the other plumbers Atea had claimed were dead. The Incursion princess glared at 7-7. You said you saw them fry! Jen snorted. Yeah, my partner's smarter than your lackeys, Atea. Rook smiled slightly, the proto-tool still aimed at Atea. I appreciate your confidence. You've earned it. But Atea wasn't one to go out without a fight. She pulled a small, unassuming-looking blaster from her belt and leveled it at Jen. I hate you so much. Atea bit out. Rook's eyes widened, his hold on his proto-tool tightening as Hobble yelped. Technodon Dissipator. He identified the weapon mostly for Jen's benefit. Though she'd run up against Technodon robots before, she had little knowledge of their smaller tech. That had always been Kevin's area of expertise. Dangerous? Jen asked, her hand inching to the Omnitrix. Only if it goes off. As if to prove Rook's point, Atea pressed the trigger. Several things happened all at once. 6-6-7-7 and their female companion 8-8 dove away from Atea, who was knocked off her feet by the force of the blast. Rook seized Jen by the hood of her jacket and pulled her off her feet, out of the way of the blast, dropping the proto-tool in the process. This was, as it turned out, unnecessary, as Vilgax had also moved at that moment, stepping between the blast and the spot Jen had been standing the moment before. He crumpled to the floor as everyone in the room stilled, stunned by this turn of events. What the fuck? Was all Jen could think to say, blinking at her fallen enemy. Vilgax, though, gave no answer as he was on the floor, his armor smoking. Jen's eyes narrowed as Atea mocked both Rook and Vilgax. 2 acts of heroism, one a bit smarter than the other. The frog-like princess commented flippantly before laughing. Mutilate them! Her assassins squared up against the plumbers as Jen leapt from Rook's arms, slapping down the dial on the Omnitrix. The floor shook as Gravitack landed. Okay, now you pissed me off. She rumbled, and the 4 villains went flying into the air. They spun round for a moment before 7-7 caught hold of a pipe and tried to fire back at the living asteroid. His mistake, as she merely redirected the gravity field, sending their own shots back at them. She increased the gravity on the 4 of them, though it took bringing down a very heavy vent cover on top of 8-8 to stop her. Once they stopped moving, Jen let up and nodded to Rook, and the 2 plumbers with him. Now, can you please find the communications room and call for backup? Rook nodded, glancing over at the prone, still smoking form of Jen's oldest enemy. We will see to it. He ushered the others out of the room, confident that Jen could handle the rest. She would likely need a moment. There had been confusion in her eyes when Vilgax took the shot meant for her. Of course, none of them had expected that. She stepped forward as she transformed back into herself, the Omnitrix beeping, the face going yellow. She spun the dial twice to the left and halfway back to the right, activating the scanner and running the yellow beam of light over 8-8. She just hoped that this transformation would come with the armor, too. She wasn't entirely sure that what this species looked like under that. She shook her head. Never thought it would end like this, Squidface. She commented to the silent room. She was not expecting an answer. After all, Atea and her assassins were unconscious. So she really wasn't expecting the burning sting of laser fire straight to her back. She screamed. The gun had been set to stun, which was lucky. If it hadn't been, she might well have been done for. She crumpled, her head smacking into the fallen vent cover as her limbs spasmed. She managed to land on her back, which she regretted as another jolt of pain shot through her, the place where the laser had made contact with her meeting the ground. Vilgax was standing over her, the shock manacles falling from around his wrists, destroyed by the blast he'd stepped in front of.
Oh, this is far from over, child.
He leveled the blaster at her again, and she screamed as another jolt passed through her and her world went black.